What's the worst way your parents tried to control you? Mine told me to choose my N-word boyfriend or this family. I stared at them in disbelief. If you marry that gorilla, you're dead to us. No inheritance. Nothing. But Michael is a doctor, I said. He volunteers at church. He loves me. He's black, my mother said. Like that erased everything else. That's all that matters. Fine. I stood up, unclasped the family heirloom necklace my grandmother had given me, and set it on the table. Keep your inheritance. I choose love. What my parents didn't know was that Michael's father, William, was the CEO of the pharmaceutical company where my dad had worked as regional manager for 20 years. My mom was head of HR at their subsidiary. William had been quietly protecting them for the past 5 years, burying every complaint filed against my father, having his legal team silently smooth over my mother's mishandled reports, all as a favor to me, his future daughter-in-law. The Monday after I left, my father showed up to work and found his keycard deactivated. Security walked him out with a cardboard box. Retroactive termination for creating a hostile work environment. 20 years of pension gone, stock options voided. The official letter cited 14 incidents, each with dates, witnesses, and his own emails attached. My mother lasted until Wednesday. Federal investigators showed up with her falsified reports. She was given 2 options: resign immediately with no severance, or face federal charges. She resigned. They had 48 hours to vacate the company housing they'd been living in rent-free. Week 2 brought the domino effect. With no income, they couldn't cover their foster children's specialized therapy, and the state requires proof of financial stability for foster parents. A social worker came for a routine check and found my mother day drinking at 10 a.m. and my father putting holes in the walls. The boys they'd been fostering toward adoption were removed immediately. Their church learned the real reason behind the firings that same week. The pastor asked them to step back from their leadership roles. My father had been a deacon for 15 years. My mother ran the women's ministry. Their entire social circle ran through that church, and suddenly no one was returning their calls. The Wednesday Bible study met without them. The harvest festival they'd organized for a decade went on with new organizers. Week 3. The financial collapse picked up speed. They tried to refinance the house, but couldn't without jobs. The mortgage they'd been skating on with company bonuses became instantly unmanageable. My father's brother, who'd borrowed $50,000 for his business with a promise to repay once things settled, stopped answering their calls. My mother's sister, whom they'd co-signed a loan for, declared bankruptcy and dragged their credit down with her. The country club canceled their membership over non-payment. My father's golf buddies' all work connections evaporated. Then the health insurance ran out. My mother's diabetes medication cost $900 a month uncovered. My father's blood pressure pills, another $400. They tried marketplace insurance, but with their pre-existing conditions, the only plan available ran $2,000 a month. My mother started rationing insulin. My father stopped taking his medication entirely. Within 2 weeks, my mother was in the ER with diabetic ketoacidosis, a $48,000 bill. My father's blood pressure spiked so high he had a minor stroke in the hospital parking lot, another $62,000. Week 4 brought the lawsuits. 3 former employees from my father's team filed discrimination suits the moment they heard he'd been fired. Without the company's legal shield, he was personally liable, each suit demanding $100,000. My mother was named in a federal investigation for falsifying data, a $250,000 fine or 5 years in prison. Their lawyer wanted a $50,000 retainer they didn't have. The public defender they got instead told them to brace for the worst. The house went into foreclosure after 90 days. Their cars got repossessed the same week. My father's prized vintage Mustang, the one he'd restored with his own father, sold at auction for a fraction of its worth. They moved into my elderly grandmother's house, but she had dementia and kept calling the police to report intruders. After the 5th false alarm, Adult Protective Services stepped in, decided my parents were being exploitative by staying there, and forced them out. They ended up in a weekly rate motel. My father got a job at a grocery store but was fired after a customer recognized him from a social media post about his termination. My mother applied to 57 jobs and got 0 callbacks. Their names were poison in the industry. The state they'd lived in for 40 years suddenly felt hostile. Everyone knew what they'd done, why they'd lost it all. The racist parents who chose hate over their own daughter. 6 months later, they called me from a borrowed phone. "We're sorry," my mother sobbed. "We were wrong. Please, we need help." I looked over at Michael. He nodded. "Tell me to be there in 30. I put the phone back to my ear. Grays Avenue, Hugs Cafe, 30 minutes. I'm not waiting around. I hung up, and Michael and I headed out the door. The drive to Grays Avenue took 15 minutes but felt like hours, my stomach doing flips the whole way. Michael kept one hand on the wheel and the other on my knee, his thumb tracing small circles that usually calmed me down but weren't working today. We got to Hugs Cafe 20 minutes early, exactly as planned, and I chose a corner table near the exit where I could watch the door. The wooden chair felt cold through my jeans as I sat facing the entrance. Michael went to talk to Hannah Avery, the manager we knew from weekend visits, pointing at our table and making hand gestures that probably meant possible drama. Hannah nodded, gave him a knowing look, and drifted closer to the counter to keep an eye on us. I pulled out my phone and texted my therapist, Celia Sterling. 3 words we'd rehearsed for exactly this kind of situation. She texted back immediately with the boundary reminder we'd gone over 100 times in her office. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the pen when I grabbed a napkin from the dispenser. Michael sat down beside me instead of across, close enough that our shoulders touched. I wrote 4 rules in big block letters so there'd be no confusion. No racist language, not even hints or jokes. No blaming Michael or his family for what happened. No asking for money directly or trying to guilt us into it. We leave immediately if any rule gets broken. The pen kept slipping in my sweaty fingers, and the handwriting looked like a kid's homework. Michael took my hand under the table and squeezed it 3 times, our signal that everything would be okay. He leaned close enough that I caught his cologne, the same one from our first date, and reminded me we could walk out the second I felt unsafe. The bell over the door rang and my whole body tensed, but it was just some college kids grabbing coffee. 10 minutes later it rang again, and there they were. My parents looked nothing like the people who'd thrown me out 6 months earlier. My mother's designer clothes were gone, replaced by a faded sweater hanging loose on her smaller frame and jeans worn through at the knees. Her hair, which she used to get done every 2 weeks, was growing out gray at the roots and pulled into a messy ponytail. My father walked behind her, shoulders hunched forward like he was carrying something heavy, nothing like the straight-backed man who used to command every room. His golf shirt was wrinkled with a small stain near the pocket. They spotted us and started over my mother, moving quickly, my father dragging his feet. I gripped Michael's hand so hard under the table, my nails probably left marks. They sat down across from us and my mother's face crumpled instantly, tears sliding down her cheeks before she even spoke. She kept apologizing over and over through the sobs, her hands reaching across the table toward me before retreating. My father sat like a statue, staring at a spot on the wall behind my head, jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscle jumping. I slid the napkin with our rules across the table, the paper hissing softly against the wood. My voice came out steadier than expected as I told them these terms weren't optional if we were going to have this conversation. My mother wiped her eyes with a tissue and nodded quickly, but my father's face reddened as he read them. They started talking over each other, my mother's voice high and shaky, my father's coming out rough like he hadn't used it in a while, medical bills piling up faster than they could track, 3 lawsuits from his former employees, finally comfortable coming forward, living in a motel that cost $200 a week, peanut butter sandwiches for dinner. My mother pulled a crumpled piece of paper from her purse and smoothed it on the table with shaking hands, a list of her medications with prices penciled in beside each. $900 a month for insulin, $300 for blood pressure medicine, another $200 for anxiety medication she'd recently started. My father finally spoke directly to us, his voice cracking as he admitted they were desperate. The proud man who'd never asked anyone for anything was sitting there basically begging. I took a breath and told them something they didn't know, that William had been protecting them for years. Because of me. My father's face went from red to purple, the veins in his neck standing out. Michael stayed calm beside me, his doctor voice kicking in as he explained that William had simply stopped intervening after what they'd done. Their current situation was the result of their own actions finally catching up with them, not some revenge plot. My father's hand slammed down on the table hard enough to knock over the salt shaker. Coffee cups at other tables paused midair as people turned to stare. He accused us of orchestrating the whole thing, of destroying them out of spite. Hannah started toward our table, phone in hand. I kept my voice low but firm, reminding my father that one more outburst meant we were leaving and this conversation was over for good. My mother grabbed his arm with both hands, knuckles white, begging him to calm down. Please, they needed this. Then she turned to me with desperate eyes and asked if we could at least help with her insulin, just the insulin, $900 a month, she could die without it. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder I'd put together the night before. Unable to sleep printed pages on assistance programs, free legal aid services, medical clinics with sliding scale payment based on income. I told them I'd only help through official channels and programs, never direct cash, because I had to protect my own boundaries and goals. My father pushed the folder away without even looking at it, saying they needed real help, not bureaucracy. My mother, though, picked it up carefully and folded it small enough to fit in her purse, handling it like it was made of gold. The conversation shifted when my mother mentioned the church, how they wouldn't even let them volunteer at the food bank anymore. Her voice cracked, talking about losing that community after 15 years. Real pain in her eyes, different from the desperation over money. I told them Pastor Tiana Rodriguez might consider starting a restorative justice process, but only if they were willing to take real accountability. The words hung between us like a test they had to pass. My father looked down at his coffee and muttered something under his breath about those people always sticking together, and I pushed my chair back so hard it screeched against the floor. I stood up, grabbed my purse, and told him one more racist comment meant this was over for good. No more meetings, no more help, nothing. He backpedaled immediately, waving his hands, claiming he meant the church people who'd abandoned them, not black people, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine, and we all knew exactly what he'd meant. Michael put a hand on my arm and gently suggested they start with the medical assistance programs, since health was the most urgent issue. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, saying a colleague could send information on manufacturer programs that could cut the insulin cost by 70%. My father scoffed, arms crossed, saying we were offering them crumbs while living in our nice house with our good jobs, but my mother reached across and thanked Michael, her voice shaking. I sat back down slowly and told them the next step was proving they were actually using these programs before we'd meet again, scheduled intake appointments, submitted applications, real documented effort, not just promises. My mother nodded quickly and pulled out a small notebook, writing everything down with a shaky hand. But my father slammed his palm on the table again, saying we were treating them like children who needed supervision, like they couldn't be trusted to run their own lives. Hannah walked past our table again, slower this time, clearly monitoring the situation. I kept my voice steady and told him this was about rebuilding trust that had been completely shattered, and trust now required verification. My mother grabbed his arm again and whispered something about needing this help, and he finally stopped arguing, though his jaw stayed locked tight. We all stood to leave, the meeting clearly finished. My mother stepped toward me with her arms slightly raised and hugged me briefly, just a quick squeeze, whispering that she was sorry for everything, for all of it, for not standing up to him sooner. My father had already turned and was walking toward the door without looking back, without saying goodbye, without even acknowledging Michael existed. Michael and I walked to the car in silence. The second I sat down in the passenger seat, it all hit me at once, not just tears but full body, shaking sobs that lasted 10 minutes while Michael held my hand and said nothing. 3 days later, my mother called from the motel phone, asking if I could help her figure out the insulin manufacturer's website since she couldn't make sense of the forms. I opened my laptop and walked her through each page, screenshotting everything so there'd be documentation of every step. While filling out the income verification section, she mentioned my father refused to apply for any programs at all, he'd rather die than beg for handouts. she said, and I could hear how worn down she was from arguing with him about everything. The application required uploading bank statements and tax returns, which meant a trip to the library to scan them since they no longer had a computer. I stayed on the phone with her for 2 hours, walking through every requirement, every proof of poverty they demanded. Later that afternoon, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Emmett McGregor from Williams' company. He said he needed to warn me that helping my parents directly could look like retaliation or manipulation, given everything with their termination. Legal was worried about optics if it got out that the CEO's son's wife was now involved with the people the company had fired for cause. He suggested keeping any assistance at arm's length, third parties or official programs only, never direct transfers or personal involvement. The call left me more confused than before, wondering if getting involved at all was making things worse. The next morning, I called Celia's office and booked an emergency session for that afternoon, telling the receptionist it was urgent. At her office, I spent the first 20 minutes just recounting everything from the cafe. Every word, every look, every feeling. Celia helped me see I was trying to save them now the way I couldn't save the relationship before, trying to fix everything retroactively. We worked on separating compassion from codependency, on understanding that helping them didn't require sacrificing my own well-being or boundaries. She gave me homework. Write down exactly what I was and wasn't willing to do. Concrete limits to reference when emotions got overwhelming. Michael decided to meet my father alone at a different coffee shop the following week, texting that he wanted to try talking man-to-man without me there. 3 hours later, he texted that it had been a disaster. My father had spent the whole time ranting about the injustice of his situation, the betrayal by Williams' company, how we'd destroyed his life. He never once took responsibility, Michael said, just kept circling back to how he was the real victim. We agreed that night that my father clearly needed a lot more time before he was ready for actual help, and Michael shouldn't meet him alone again, for safety's sake. 2 days after that, Pastor Tiana Rodriguez called my cell to say my mother had reached out about possibly returning to church. She was willing to facilitate some kind of reconciliation process, but only if both my parents completed specific accountability work first. She emailed a list of requirements: written acknowledgement of the specific harms they'd caused, anti-racism education with certified instructors, and consistent counseling attendance for at least 3 months. The list ran 3 pages, covering everything from public apologies to the foster children's therapists, to financial restitution for former employees they discriminated against. The following Monday, my mother called to say she'd started intake at an outpatient program run by someone named Alana Tillman. She sounded proud of herself, said she was committed to getting sober, that she knew she had a problem and wanted to fix it. I told her I was proud of her for taking that step, but made clear I wouldn't be her accountability partner, sponsor, or emotional support system. That was what the program and Alana were for, and she needed to lean on them instead of me. 2 weeks later, my phone rang at midnight showing my mother's number. She was drunk, crying hard, saying she couldn't do this anymore, that she'd lost everything because she followed my dad like always. I could hear bottles clinking in the background, her words getting harder to parse. I hung up and immediately called Alana's emergency line, gave them her location at the motel, told them about the relapse. Someone was sent within the hour to check on her and adjust her treatment plan. The next morning, I opened Facebook to find my dad had posted a huge rant about being destroyed by reverse racism, naming Michael's family directly, calling William a criminal who targeted white people. Coworkers started texting me screenshots, asking if I was okay, if I needed anything. The post had already been shared over 200 times. I called Jayla immediately, and she drafted a cease and desist letter that afternoon, sent certified mail to the motel. She said we needed to document everything now, since desperate people do desperate things, and we might need a restraining order soon. I started screenshotting everything, saving voicemails, logging every contact attempt. Emmett called me at work 3 days later to say the board was now reviewing all of Williams' decisions from the past 5 years, including the protection he'd extended to my parents. People were asking questions about favoritism, whether William had overstepped his authority. Michael's mom was getting looks at her book club. His dad was facing extra scrutiny at every meeting. The chaos was spreading to people who'd only ever tried to help us, and it made me sick. That night, I sat at my computer and blocked my dad everywhere: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all of it. I changed my phone settings so unknown numbers went straight to voicemail. I told Jayla she was now the only point of contact for anything involving my father. Part of me felt instant relief, like I could finally breathe. Another part felt like I'd cut off my own arm. A week later, Jayla called to say Pierre, my dad's court-appointed attorney, had reached out about a subpoena. One of the discrimination lawsuits needed my deposition about things I'd witnessed at my dad's workplace over the years. My stomach dropped, because I knew exactly what they'd want to hear about the comments at company picnics, the jokes he made when he thought only family was listening, the way he talked about his black employees at dinner. I hired my own lawyer the next day, separate from the company's legal team, someone who'd protect just my interests. The retainer was $5,000, and Michael wrote the check without hesitating. Said we couldn't risk getting pulled into my dad's mess without proper protection. My new lawyer told me I'd have to tell the truth, but we could prepare so I wouldn't offer more than necessary. Celia and I spent 3 sessions preparing for the deposition, practicing how to answer without adding extra information or getting emotional. She taught me a breathing technique: count to 4 on the inhale, hold 4, exhale 4, and we practiced what to do if my dad tried to make eye contact or reacted to what I said. She had me write down just facts. No interpretation, no feelings, only what I'd seen and heard. The deposition took place in a cold downtown conference room, with a court reporter typing away. My dad sat across from me with Pierre, and I could feel him staring the entire time. The opposing lawyer asked about specific incidents, and I answered with only facts. Yes, I heard him use that word. Yes, I was present when he made that comment about promotions. Yes, I saw him throw away resumes with certain names. My dad tried to interrupt once, talking about how he'd provided for me, paid for college, given me everything. Pierre grabbed his arm to stop him, and the opposing lawyer looked satisfied with every answer I gave. By the end, Pierre looked defeated, like he already knew the case was lost. My mother called that night to say my dad wouldn't even say my name anymore, just called me her, or that one. Then she told me things I'd never known: that my grandfather had been part of some group in the 60s that fought against integration, that there had been violence involved and my dad had grown up watching it. She said he'd learned hate from his father, the way his father had learned it from his own. The The pattern went back generations. Though that didn't make it right, she said. Just helped explain it. She was sober on this call. I could tell tired but clear. She said she was staying with the program this time, that she had too much left to lose, even though she'd already lost most of it. I told her I was proud of her for trying and hung up before the conversation could go anywhere else. 2 days later, Pastor Tiana called to say she was setting up a meeting with the church elders about my parents' situation. Dominic Sanchez and 3 other elders would be there, but my father wasn't invited since he hadn't done any of the required prep work. I could hear papers shuffling as she explained they needed to figure out if redemption was even possible and what it would take for my parents to begin that process. The meeting happened Thursday, and Tiana called after to say the elders were split on whether to allow my parents back at all. Dominic thought my mother might have a shot if she stayed sober and completed the accountability program, but everyone agreed my father needed serious work before they'd even consider it. That same night, Michael and I had our first real fight about the whole situation. He came home from a long shift, found me on the phone with Alana about my mother's program, and just lost it. He said I was pouring energy into people who called him a gorilla and told me I was dead to them. We went back and forth for an hour, him saying I was letting them hurt me all over again, me saying I couldn't just abandon them completely. We finally agreed to start weekly sessions with Vaughn Sterling, one of Celia's colleagues who specialized in couples navigating family trauma. Our first appointment was awkward, both of us stuck at opposite ends of the couch, but Vaughn helped us see we were each right in different ways. The next week, I called the clinic near my mother's motel and arranged for her insulin to be delivered there directly. Nina Sterling, a social worker at the facility, would monitor when she picked it up to make sure she wasn't trading it for alcohol money, which it turned out she'd been doing, which is why I couldn't trust her with direct deliveries anymore. The arm's length approach felt cold, but Nina said it was the safest way to help without enabling. 3 weeks into the new system, my mother relapsed hard. Alana called me at work to say she'd been found passed out in the motel parking lot and recommended inpatient treatment immediately. But when we called the insurance company, they said they wouldn't cover it without proof of medical necessity beyond addiction alone. The private facility wanted $30,000 up front, which I refused to pay directly. Instead, I spent the next 2 days helping my mother appeal the insurance denial through proper channels, with documentation from her ER visits and Alana's treatment notes. Meanwhile, William's company board kept investigating his past decisions, including the protection he'd given my parents. Michael's mother suggested we skip family dinners for a while since the tension had become unbearable. Every Sunday dinner had turned into a silent meal, everyone avoiding eye contact, leaving as soon as possible. The stress of being caught between 2 families dealing with the fallout of my parents' choices was wearing everyone thin. Then my work situation blew up when 3 different colleagues forwarded me screenshots of my father's Facebook rants. He was calling for boycotts of my company and making wild accusations of discrimination against him. HR called me in to open a formal documentation file and said they were increasing building security after someone matching my father's description had been spotted in the parking garage twice that week. Hannah from Hugs Cafe reached out through Jayla with a written statement about my father's behavior that day, how he'd slammed his hand on the table and raised his voice enough that other customers looked worried, and she'd almost called the police. Jayla added it to our growing file for a potential restraining order. When I saw how thick that folder had gotten, I couldn't quite believe this was my life now. The breaking point came when my father left 3 threatening voicemails at Michael's hospital, saying he'd make Michael pay for destroying our family. Hospital security pulled Michael aside to play the messages and asked if we wanted to press charges. Jayla filed for an emergency protective order that same day, and it was granted within 48 hours. Police served it to my father at the motel, and the officer told him any violation meant immediate arrest, no warnings. My father apparently threw a fit and had to be restrained from going after the officer, but they let that slide too, with just a warning. Through all this chaos, my mother somehow strung together 30 days of documented sobriety with perfect attendance at her program meetings. Alana called to say she was asking if I'd attend a family session to work on our relationship. I agreed, but set strict conditions Vaughn had helped me develop. The session had to happen at the facility, not somewhere neutral. Vaughn would attend with me for support, and we'd only focus on moving forward, not rehashing the past. The session was set for the following Tuesday, and I spent the night before practicing what I wanted to say with Michael. When we arrived, my mother was already there, nervous but clear-eyed in a way I hadn't seen in months. Vaughn sat beside me, Alana beside my mother, and we opened with ground rules about respectful communication. My mother surprised me by starting with specific apologies about things she'd said and done, without excuses or minimizing. She talked about calling Michael those awful names, about saying I was dead to them, about knowing those words could never be taken back. It felt real. Even if not complete, she still talked about following my father's lead like she'd never had a choice of her own. I told her I appreciated the effort, but trust would take years to rebuild, if it ever could be rebuilt at all. 3 days after that session, Nina called about a spot opening at a sober living facility, which needed a $5,000 deposit within 24 hours. I drove to the program's financial office and filled out the paperwork to pay directly from my account into theirs, my mother never touching the money. The administrator ran my card and handed me a receipt while Nina sat with my mother in the waiting room explaining curfews, mandatory group sessions, and random drug tests. My mother grabbed my hand as I walked past and squeezed hard enough to leave marks, but I kept walking. I couldn't handle her crying right then. 2 weeks into the sober living arrangement, my phone rang at 3 a.m. A nurse saying my father was in the cardiac unit after his blood pressure hit 220/140, and he'd listed me as emergency contact. Michael drove us to the hospital, where a security guard met us at the entrance and walked us to the cardiac wing because of the restraining order. My father looked small in the hospital bed, monitors beeping, tubes everywhere, and the moment he saw us, he started in about how this was all our fault for destroying his life. The nurse checked his vitals while he ranted about losing everything because of us, Michael standing by the door ready to leave if it turned bad. His voice cracked when he mentioned his own father used to take him to meetings where they talked about keeping races separate, said that was just normal back then. I told him being taught wrong didn't mean he couldn't learn right, and at 62 he had no excuse for not figuring that out himself. He turned his face to the wall and wouldn't look at me again. So we left after signing the paperwork confirming I'd been notified. Pierre Jacobson called the next morning to say one of the discrimination lawsuits was settling for $75,000 my father didn't have, which meant bankruptcy was coming. He explained the process would wipe out remaining debts along with any assets, though at this point my father had nothing left worth protecting anyway. Hearing about his financial ruin felt strange, like watching someone who worshipped money lose every last penny. Pastor Tiana reached out that afternoon, proposing a restorative justice circle where my father could eventually face the employees he'd harmed, but only after finishing an intensive anti-racism program first. The requirements included weekly sessions for 6 months, reading assignments, and community service focused on understanding systemic racism. My father apparently agreed to start the program, but Dominic Sanchez called me privately 2 days later to say a background check had turned up recent activity from my father in online supremacist forums. My father claimed he was just venting about his situation, but the post went well beyond venting into actual hate speech and threats. Dominic said the church couldn't move forward with any reconciliation until my father completely cut ties with those groups and showed real change, not just surface compliance. I had Jayla send my father a formal letter stating my one condition for any future relationship: he had to publicly disavow his racist views and the online hate groups. Non-negotiable without it. I'd never attend any reconciliation attempt, no matter what else he did. 3 days later, my father posted a statement online saying he'd made mistakes and said things in anger he regretted, but never once mentioned race, racism, or the specific things he'd actually done. The comments exploded with people calling out the weak non-apology, and screenshots of his hate forum posts started circulating again. Pastor Tiana called to say he clearly wasn't ready, and suggested we focus on my mother's progress instead, since she was actually doing the work. The restorative circle moved forward the following week with just my mother, meeting 2 former employees she'd discriminated against. I watched through a window as she sat across from them, listening to how her actions had affected their careers and families, without interrupting or making excuses. She nodded, took notes, apologized for specific incidents they raised, though she stopped short of acknowledging the larger pattern of systemic discrimination she'd been part of. One employee cried, describing how my mother had blocked her promotion 3 separate times with manufactured performance issues, and my mother's face went white hearing the real impact of it. After 2 hours they finished, and my mother looked exhausted but somehow lighter, like she'd set down something heavy she'd been carrying a long time. Alana called that evening to discuss next steps, and I made clear I wasn't ready for direct reconciliation, but would agree to monthly check-ins with professional mediation. We scheduled the first for the following month at a neutral counseling center, with Alana and Vaughn both present to keep things structured and safe. The boundaries felt right, they kept me protected while leaving a small door open for the possibility my mother might actually change. Michael supported the decision, though he made clear he wouldn't attend these sessions, and I respected that, since my family had specifically targeted him with their hate. 2 weeks passed before Dominic called to say my mother had started working at the church thrift store, sorting donations in the back room where she wouldn't interact with customers yet. He watched her show up every morning at 8 sharp and work until 2 without complaint, even when they had her cleaning bathrooms and hauling out trash. The small paycheck barely covered her expenses at the sober living facility, but she thanked him every Friday like he'd handed her $1 million. I drove by once just to see if it was real, and spotted her through the window organizing clothes by size with the same focus she used to apply to destroying people's careers. That same afternoon, Emmett called with an update from William's company on the board investigation that had been hanging over everyone for months. William got hit with a formal censure for overstepping his authority but kept his position, with new oversight requirements and monthly reviews of his decisions going forward. The relief in Emmett's voice told me how close it had come to being much worse, but the damage to family relationships was already done. Michael's parents invited us to dinner that weekend at their favorite Italian place, and the tension started before we even sat down. His mother kept stirring her wine without drinking it. His father studied the menu like it held state secrets. Nobody mentioned the investigation, or my parents, or anything that mattered until halfway through the main course, when his mother set down her fork and said we needed to separate family from business going forward. Michael agreed immediately and suggested monthly dinners with a strict no work talk rule, which his parents accepted with visible relief. 3 days later, my mother called through Nina at the facility to ask if I'd co-sign her application for subsidized housing, since she'd held steady employment for a month. I drove to the housing office and provided verification of her employment, but refused to put my name on any financial documents. Nina helped her understand that was actually the better outcome for both of us. My mother nodded and filled out the paperwork herself while I watched from across the room, remembering when she used to forge documents without a second thought. The next morning, my phone rang at 5 a.m., with my father screaming about needing $3,000 for a bankruptcy lawyer immediately. I hung up and texted him the same legal aid resources I'd sent twice before, which triggered a voicemail so full of rage that Jayla added it to our restraining order file within the hour. Pierre called later to apologize for my father's behavior and confirm the bankruptcy filing would proceed with or without private counsel. 2 days after that, my workplace security called to say my father was in the lobby demanding to see me, despite the protective order. Police arrived within 10 minutes and issued him a formal warning that the next violation meant automatic arrest with no bond until trial. The officer who took my statement mentioned that most people need to actually get arrested before boundaries start to feel real to them. I sat in Celia's office the following week, going through my symptom checklist, and realized I'd slept through the night 4 times that week without a single nightmare. My shoulders didn't automatically tense when the phone rang anymore, and I'd gone 3 whole days without checking over my shoulder in parking lots. She pointed out that healing isn't a straight line, but my trajectory was clearly upward, which is all anyone can ask for after this kind of trauma. The facility called to invite me to my mother's 6-month sobriety celebration, and I agreed to attend for exactly 20 minutes with Michael. We arrived to find her surrounded by other residents singing some recovery song, holding a little plastic chip like it was made of gold. I handed her a card with a simple message about being proud of her work, and she mouthed thank you, while tears ran down her face. Michael and I left without hugging her, but the eye contact felt like progress compared to 6 months earlier. Pastor Tiana worked behind the scenes for weeks to get the church board to approve my mother returning as a regular member under strict behavioral agreements. She could attend services and Bible study, but couldn't hold leadership positions, handle money, or access member information. The Sunday she returned, several people moved to different pews, but enough stayed that she had someone to sit with. Alana called it crucial for sustained recovery to have community beyond just the treatment facility. Meanwhile, my father finished his court-mandated anger management program and submitted his completion certificate to the Restorative Justice Committee. Dominic pulled me aside after reviewing it to share his concerns that my father was just going through the motions, with no real internal change. The therapist's notes mentioned consistent deflection and blame shifting, even in the final session. We scheduled a follow-up evaluation in 3 months to reassess whether he was ready for any kind of reconciliation process. Michael and I sat at our kitchen table that evening with a calendar between us, picking a date 3 months out for our courthouse ceremony. We wanted something small and quiet, just his parents and maybe 5 or 6 friends who'd stuck with us through everything. I called the courthouse the next morning to book the slot and paid the $75 fee over the phone. Michael made dinner reservations at a nice restaurant for after nothing fancy, just a place we liked downtown. 2 weeks before the wedding, I wrote identical letters to both my parents, printed on plain paper and addressed to their counselors. My mother said she could attend if she stayed sober, brought Nina as her support, and sat in the back row without approaching other guests. My father's explained that, given the safety concerns and the protective order, he wasn't invited, but I'd send photos afterward. I dropped both letters at the post office on a Tuesday morning, getting delivery confirmation on each. Alana called 3 days later to say my mother had read the letter during their session and accepted all the conditions without pushback. Pierre left a voicemail that same afternoon, saying my father had torn his letter up and thrown it in the trash while yelling about being excluded. The morning of our wedding brought perfect spring weather. I put on a simple white dress I'd bought at Nordstrom Rack for $90. Michael wore his best suit, the one he usually saved for medical conferences, and we drove to the courthouse together, holding hands. His parents were already waiting outside with our friends, everyone dressed nice but casual, nobody making a fuss. I spotted my mother sitting on a bench near the entrance with Nina beside her, both in simple dresses, keeping their distance just as we'd agreed. The ceremony took 15 minutes in a wood-paneled room with fluorescent lights and plastic chairs. The judge read the standard vows. We exchanged rings we'd bought online for $200 each, and Michael added his own line about choosing love over fear every single day. I saw my mother dabbing her eyes with the tissue Nina handed her, but she stayed seated and never tried to approach us. After signing the papers, we walked out married, our small group clapping and snapping photos on their phones. My mother stood as we passed, mouthing congratulations before sitting back down, and I gave her one nod before we headed off to the restaurant. The next morning, I printed our best wedding photo at CVS and wrote 2 identical notes explaining this was for their information only, not an invitation for contact. I included updated resource lists for housing assistance, medical programs, and job placement services I'd researched myself. Both envelopes went out in that afternoon's mail with no return address. Just the photo and the information, nothing personal attached. 3 weeks later, Pierre called to say my father had accepted a warehouse job in Arizona, loading trucks for minimum wage, plus overtime. The move technically violated his agreement to stay local for the legal proceedings, but the court approved it since he'd shown up for every required appearance so far. The distance meant no more surprise visits to my workplace, no more angry run-ins at the grocery store. My father sent one final email before leaving, saying he hoped I was happy destroying his life, which Jayla immediately added to our documentation file. Meanwhile, my mother had been working with the housing program for months, and was finally approved for a subsidized studio downtown. Nina helped her move in with donated furniture from the church, setting up her medications and a weekly pill organizer on the kitchen counter. The apartment was tiny, just 300 square feet, but it was hers, and she could afford it on her thrift store wages. She sent me a photo through Alana of the new place, everything neat and organized, her sobriety chips displayed on a little shelf. We started meeting for coffee once a month at a park halfway between our places, always Saturday mornings when it was busy with families and dog walkers. We'd sit on the same bench by the pond, talking about her job, sorting donations, or my latest project at work, never touching my father or the past. She'd drink black coffee from the cart while I had tea, and we'd watch the ducks for exactly 1 hour before going our separate ways. The conversation stayed surface level, the weather, a book she was reading for her recovery group, nothing deeper. After 6 months of these meetings, I could see real changes in her, not just the sobriety, but an actual understanding of what she'd done. She never asked for more time or pushed the boundaries, just showed up when we agreed and left when the hour was up. Looking back now, at everything that happened over this year, I can see how justice came in small, messy pieces, rather than one big dramatic moment. My mother crawled toward accountability one day at a time, while my father stayed stuck in his anger 3 states away. I learned that loving someone doesn't mean saving them from consequences, and sometimes the best thing you can do is protect your own peace while letting people face what they've created. Appreciate you hanging out with me through all this. I've still got a ton of questions myself, that's just how my brain works. I'll see you around next time. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all of them.